Good afternoon, everybody. I'm sorry that I'm not there in person. I got my signals crossed and I'm in not sunny Philadelphia. But I would like to thank Drs. Gogwala and Sue for inviting me to participate in the symposium. The title of this talk is what I learned from trying to get an RCT off the ground. And this is in conjunction with a CSRS grant that I got a couple years ago. So I have no financial disclosures which are relevant to the topic of this. So this is the outline. I want to talk a little bit about this study, just to give you a sense of where we were trying to go with this. Talk about studies. Shortly thereafter, we had a lot of study site disinterest from other sites besides our own. A little bit about the type of problems that we encountered, and then the lessons that I missed and that I hope other people can take away in designing their own studies. Start first with kind of the basics of the study. This study was largely motivated by both the successes and the deficiencies of the AO spine geriatric odontoid fracture study, to be sure, but was observational with 159 patients. And this showed an advantage for surgical treatment of type 2 odontoid fractures in terms of really almost all the outcome metrics that we tracked, which is NDI, SF36 pain, ability to achieve union, and a very, very narrowly missed a clear mortality benefit by sort of hundredths of a point on the p-value. The limitations is that there's some selection bias in the study because individual sites were choosing their treatment algorithm, and it led to some sites treating most patients with surgery, some sites treating most patients without surgery, and then everything in between. And so there's always a concern about cherry picking. Next slide. And so we wanted to try to correct the deficiencies of that study by doing this in a randomized controlled fashion to try to take away the selection bias. And so we were trying to include patients with type 2 fractures, 65 and 90 years old, who this is a result of blunt trauma with sort of a known injury. And we plan to use a block randomization strategy to either a posterior cervical fusion at C1-2 with a soft collar for 2 weeks or 8 weeks in a hard collar as the two sort of treatment groups, and plan to basically track the same things that we had tracked in the other study. We were not going to chase down CT scans just because I thought that may not really reflect outcome measure anyway. And so initially we, in pitching this, sorry, next slide. Initially in pitching this to personal context, next slide, around the country and in Canada, we had a lot of interest. We were able to distribute the IRB documents that we had completed at Jefferson to other sites just to try to aid in getting things improved, and it seemed like we were on the way to getting the study off the ground. Next slide. Very rapidly, as I mentioned, we had a good number of disinterest. Next slide. And so here I drew a line through all the initial sort of takers who went on to either not ever have the study approved or to never enroll a patient. And so you can see that's basically every other site except for Jefferson. And the Atlantic City Medical Center actually is a Rothman site in Atlantic City in New Jersey. And they are finally actually on board and going to start enrolling patients at that site as well. But this wasn't sort of what we hoped for. And there was a number of, next slide, a number of problems, which I think led to this lack of interest, not even lack of interest, but lack of ability to actually pursue this study in earnest. Next slide. These are the obstacles which, in retrospect, I identified. One, surgeons had a hard time having a discussion about equipoise. And some of this is people's own sort of biases in terms of how these patients should be treated. Some was that it's a pretty dramatic flip of the coin between having an instrumented fusion and going in a collar. So I think that is a little bit of an obstacle. It's not you're putting demineralized bone matrix or autograft where the surgery is essentially the same. The treatment groups are really different. So I got some feedback that sort of like I don't have time to go and see patients in the ER, and I'm trying to have the residents or the research staff do this, and they don't carry the same weight maybe that the surgeon would when they're giving the pitch and trying to explain the situation. And so this is a little bit of, again, partially related to the first bullet point, but this is a little bit of a hard sell. Next slide. I think that there is very, very clearly equipoise regarding the treatment of type 2 odontoid fractures at the spine surgeon community, meaning the whole, everybody at CSRS level. But this isn't always the case at institutional levels. And that was one thing that I think was hard to stomach for a lot of places, is coming from a site where they usually put these people in a collar and, 1/10 of them or 1/20 of them actually get an operation. It was hard to change the institutional bias in that regard and to say, well, basically 50% of them more or less are going to get an operation, and maybe surgeons didn't buy into doing it, or, for what have you. And so that was one thing that led a lot of people to say, listen, I don't think we can do this. And then the last thing is that people really want money to do studies, not out of greed, but just to, grease the wheel, make it easier to do, justify spending the research staff time on enrolling patients and following them up and tracking down, outcome measures and all that kind of stuff. Next slide. And so what are the lessons that I took away from this? Next slide. One is that I think there's an imperative to match the study design and really like the scope of the support level from the sponsor of the study, if there is. And while this a lot of times boils down to financial support, there isn't a level of like organizational support that you see, for instance, and we benefit from greatly in doing the prospective observational study through AO, who comes in and, has a full, suite of services that they're able to lend to make studies easier to do. Financial support helps, obviously, especially at the local level. Some of this can be mitigated through the primary site, like, for instance, distributing IRB documents to make it a little bit easier for the research staff and the investigators at the different sites. We were going to print randomization packets, and those could be FedEx, just to, again, like, take some of the burden away from the primary site to spend the time putting those together, but that only eases the burden somewhat. There's also a little bit of a difficulty with the scope of a slowly progressing study that is likely to outlast sponsor's study period. And when I gave the 1 year in talk to CSRS on sort of progress, we were just really getting going. And I think in an ideal world, the CSRS grant would support a study that is well on its way, if not done by that period of time. Next slide. This is a relatively overly ambitious, maybe multi-center randomized controlled trial, which ended up being a poor fit for a society level grant. Not to knock it, we were very, very happy and flattered to get awarded the grant, but the budget was not what I think if we had a much bigger budget, we would have been able to make this study happen on a much faster pace because places it would be easier for them to do. And so that the budget was a little bit of an obstacle. And so in summary, we're plugging along, enrolling patient by patient. We have many, many more to fix or not fix before we get to the finish line here. If anyone's interested, this is my contact information. And we would love to add on sites. Like I said, we can pass off the IRB, we can pass off randomization packets to make this as easy as possible. Thank you.